Well, Prester John moves around a lot from India to Ethiopia, and so that's also kind of well, he wasn't there, so we'll put him here, or maybe he could still be there if he's been here. And I think one of the things that's powering my book, one of the questions that's powering the book, is how medieval people were trying to make sense of a world they didn't fully know. So they knew the world was round, but they didn't know how to get around it. They knew there was more land out there that they hadn't yet experienced, but they didn't know how to get there or how to name it. And so it's more like how we think perhaps of the sea or space as something that is kind of existing but not fully charted or chartable and full of plausible mysteries and implausible mysteries, and we are not qualified to judge which are which.
Solomon and Smith.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Solomon and Smith. This time we are talking with Anthony Bale, who is the eighth professor of medieval and Renaissance English at the University of Cambridge. There's only been seven others since the medieval period.
All of whom Anthony had to murder in order to get the job.
That's sort of how it works. They've got a bit of an archaic system, but we don't hold it against them
It's
because the results are clear.
like inheriting an earldom. It was kind hearts and coronets. He had to assassinate his way up the family tree to inherit this coveted position. Even more work than Jane Cooper had to do.
Exactly, but we know it worked out pretty well, and we know he's a man of great vitality and power, as you'll see in the interviews to come. And what exactly do we talk to such a vigorous man about? I leave that to Jack.
Movement, motion, animation, going from A to B. Not existing in a sort of liminal state between A and B, like Antony and Anthony.
Yeah, we don't think that medieval people moved, that they could move. Anthony proves us very wrong on that point. Indeed, they were not only moving, but often to fairly distant locales. Ever heard of a medieval person going to Italy? We talk about that. Ever heard of a medieval person going to Jerusalem? We get there. What about Ethiopia? All of this is covered in Anthony Bale's new book, relatively new book about travel in the Middle Ages, and that's what we're talking about in particular.
We didn't talk about this, but did you know like the Khanate, the Great Khanate, in China, so in southeast China, sent two emissaries to Europe called like Rabban Bar Salma or something like that, and they wrote what they saw in Europe, and unlike the average pilgrim account, they tell you what the streets are like. Streets are different here to China, where I'm from.
But
They only
did
ever
they
mention.
like it?
No, yeah. They were treated quite well over there. It's quite interesting. There was the possibility of a coalition between the Mongol empire and the European empires, or everything under Catholicism, the sort of Western Europe, to invade the Holy Land. It was a crusade that never happened, but they got
Yeah,
distracted.
it's interesting that almost every account of a foreign land in these times is the same. They're always just amazed and in awe of what they're seeing. They then make something up astoundingly, obviously false. Everyone believes it, and they go home. It's any account of any place. They won't mention much about any language or people they meet. They will say something like, "And the testicles of the men scrape the floor," and they'll say it was
Nine-headed sheep, the size of skyscrapers.
And they'll say it was an amazing, awe-inspiring empire, the likes of which we've never seen before. And it's true also when the guys from the East went to the West. So maybe it was just a universal paradise in these days. If you were to collate all of the foreign accounts of all places.
Everywhere's wonderful, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, lots of these exaggerated accounts changed world history in a significant way. I mean, Columbus was looking for Indian trade routes, but a big deciding factor in Columbus getting the money together to do this voyage were Marco Polo's descriptions of the infinite wealth in Japan. Marco Polo had never been to Japan. He just heard of like an old Chinese man going, infinite gold over there.
It's the reason that we launched the Solomon and Smith expedition to Japan to fund the Patreon and were sorely disappointed with what we found there. There were not mountains of gold free for the taking. There's some kind of advanced civilization happening.
Very affordable cameras, but not much else.
Yeah, we had to sail back crestfallen. And so we have to ask you, our kind viewers, to make up not only the gold we didn't get, but indeed the rather exorbitant travel costs for the fleet that set off not last Sunday.
Fleet. And also don't forget to like and subscribe, friends, and comment below. No one comments. Why not? We're shy.
Make a comment about why you don't comment. That can be the comment. Even if it's hurtful.
Especially if it's hurtful.
Leave your hurtful comments down below.
A moment of truth, is it Anthony or Anthony?
Always Anthony, never Anthony, and never Tony.
Phony it is. A compromise that...
No. Anthony is fine. Anthony is fine.
You look like you're in some sort of Russian prison.
Yeah, padded cell. I'm actually in the London Library, which you'd think of it as this kind of very august 19th century building, but it's they've got some rooms upstairs where you can do Zoom calls. So I'm in one of those. I have got, actually, I can probably show you. I've got an amazing view over central London and Parliament in the background and the London Eye.
Got some rooftops.
Yeah. In terms of travel, I mean, Milo probably could run to you over the course of this Zoom call. You're in a similar geographical region. I'm in Switzerland at the moment. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That really is Switzerland.
Yeah, that checks out.
I just came from the Rhineland, and there spring is really on its way. Wilting daffodils, mid-20s temperatures. So we thought we'd, go to Switzerland, enjoy the spring, enjoy the flowers. But here it's deepest winter. You do go back in time, going down that stretch of train. I went on a very ill-advised hike yesterday. Death-defying, imprisoned in hexagons of snow hike in spring wear, meaning I'm a bit under the weather today, which our listeners will be delighted. They won't ever have to listen to me for too long at any given stretch because my voice will just crumble away.
But it's embodied. It's an embodied traveling experience. You're in the mind of the traveling European. Whereas I'm the cleric who stayed home wisely.
Yeah, you're doing it properly. No curiositas. Just pilgrimage
in the mind. In the mind and heart.
Yeah.
Very good. We start these chats with a poetic epigraph. This is probably the longest I'll talk throughout this. Bear with me. The Holy Land. This, at least, is what I insist on calling this abyss of yellow ingots, flesh-eating birds, pink rivers, shifty-eyed naked men and shrubs with slimy, translucent leaves. This is the place in which everyone and everything believes, at the center of everywhere but here, of every map but our own. Press your lips to its listening stone and tell me God created every other country once, but created the Holy Land on infinite occasions, one of which is now, another of which was the separation of darkness from darkness. One can only build a temple by believing one has already done so, thousands of years ago. Every event between now and eternity happens here simultaneously. Paper is invented, dogs are fed, bones are broken with rocks, children are shot, and all men scream subconsciously. Paradise is our inability to talk to each other, The fallenness of the world resides in its comprehensibility. There is only bloodshed between nation and nation, between man and his brother, because the one can understand the other. A wholly good reality would merely fold us into its celestial vastness by placing a giant hole into our hearts and giving us no means of locating it. Have you always been a medievalist, Anthony, or was it an incremental thing?
How far back should I go?
Womb, if
Yeah.
possible.
Begin in womb, see where we get to.
Well, if we're going back almost that far, so I grew up in a little village on the border between Cheshire and Staffordshire, and just outside the village there was a ruined castle, Healy Castle, which was owned by the Lords Audley in the Middle Ages. And from when I was, kind of 5 or 6, my dad would take me and my brother up there very often, and you could see masonry there. And my primary school teacher, a wonderful teacher called Mrs. Hollinshead, had she'd taken a metal detector up there. She'd found cannonballs, she'd found jewelry, she'd found coins. And I remember, from this point being fascinated not so much by medieval history, but by medieval people, by the idea of people in the past and their daily lives, them inhabiting this now empty set of fields and woodland near where I grew up and passed every day. Similarly, there was a place we'd go very often, a National Trust house in Cheshire called Little Morton Hall, which is a 15th, 16th century black and white house. And we go there a lot on school trips and that kind of thing. And this is one of my favorite places in the world. It still is. And there are a couple of things there that I loved. One was a kind of 15th century dog kennel. Another was the kind of walking gallery for when it was raining, which is, kind of almost every day in Cheshire. And also these amazing, I guess they're 16th century frescoes of the story of Susanna and the elders from the Bible, and kind of having this kind of playground of the Middle Ages introduced to me from childhood. I think that did influence me, but really I only became serious about it obviously when I went to university, and I'd never studied anything at all old at school, and my A-level texts only went back to Shakespeare. And I had some brilliant teachers at university. The first person to teach me Chaucer was Helen Cooper at Oxford, a kind of very committed and brilliant teacher of Chaucer. And so I had a great introduction to that kind of stuff, and I just ended up carrying on doing it. And here I am in my 50s, still doing it. So, yeah. I don't feel like I came to the Middle Ages necessarily. I mean, even though that I've just given you that kind of that sense of childhood enthusiasm, I don't think I've come to it so much from a sense of recognition or admiration for the Middle Ages, but more for a sense of proximal difference, something that is very close to us in some ways as people living in Britain, but also something which is radically other and incomprehensible and strange in other ways. And that's what I find pleasurable and enticing about studying it.
And this does seem to be the modus operandi of the book on travel, is it constantly relates medieval travel to our own experiences. And, in the contemporary age, most of us in Western Europe have traveled somewhere. It's not a sort of extraordinary thing to have done. But then you often get the curveball of just some astounding, outrageous thing that is also true of the time. And the attempt of the book is to sort of marry the two, explain how it can be that these people were just sort of looking out for a new place and buying their souvenirs. And also they believe that the men of Hormuz had testicles that reached the floor. And that's just, but we do believe outrageous things about Hormuz, especially recently. So it's sort of it's one of those perennials, but it's finding the tension between, oh, we've always been the same, but then having to recognize actually some things were and are different, and just where that line is drawn. And I'm curious as the premise of the book, Medieval Travel, it's largely taking place in the later medieval period, or mid to later. And there could be various reasons for that, technological or political, ideological, or whatever. But I'm curious, I suppose, how do we get there? And it can be a very brief sort of précis, but the early Middle Ages, I think, in the popular mind, are really associated with migration, with people moving to places. You have sort of, the Germanic tribes who moved to England. You have the Goths doing their world tour. You've got even people like the Huns. But this isn't quite travel as you define it. It's not you start at home, you go to a destination, you don't kill anyone, and you come back. That feels like a workable definition of this
You
kind
you
of
might
travel.
kill some people or you might get killed, but yeah, you didn't
Yeah,
set out to do that.
you didn't
Yeah,
mean to. It wasn't,
yeah,
top of
yeah,
the list. It was a
yeah,
few items down.
yeah.
So what did travel look like in this maybe slightly more mobile, chaotic, early medieval frame? And then how do we get to this point where we have these quite well-fashioned and well-used
Mm,
routes
yeah.
from west to east and other places?
Yeah, so I mean, you get um, versions of what I define as travel, which is this kind of a journey which you know is a journey that you've to some extent chosen as a journey, somewhere with a fixed destination and one that you probably aim to get something out of and come back from. So as opposed to migration or forced migration or wandering or getting lost, travel is a journey you understand as a journey. And you do get examples of that from the early Middle Ages, and you get some early pilgrimage accounts as well. Um, One of the differences is that these tend to be quite rare and also extremely elite travelers. They're people who are theologically and socially um, complex and unusual. Um, and they also don't have necessarily the same fixed set of destinations other than Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Whereas in the later Middle Ages, you get this network of more destinations. Um, and of course, if you've read um, kind of Viking and Anglo-Saxon poetry, then there's lots of awareness of what it means to be on a boat on the sea going somewhere. There's certainly an awareness of travel there. I really started, I mean, the book's materials for me start in the 12th and 13th century. And partly it's just an arbitrary workable moment when you've got a critical mass of sources, but also because I think the Crusades, the failure of the Crusades, or the kind of adventure of the Crusades followed by their failure, limit certain kinds of travel as occupation, travel as settling a new area, and the travel that we get in the period after the Crusades becomes much more regulated, much more financially kind of bounded, and also bounded by conflict. So most of the 13th to 15th century materials, people are aware that there's certain places they can't go, or certain things which have kind of got in the way of where they want to go. So it's only really, I think, from the 13th century where you start to get a written archive of travel in any bulk. That doesn't mean that people didn't travel before that. And it also doesn't mean that the archive we do have, even from the later Middle Ages, is at all representative. We know from somewhere like the National Archives that the place you're most likely to find evidence of travel actually is in criminal cases where people abscond, people run away and kidnap people take on new identities as they travel. Travel is really closely connected to crime, and the alibi is a kind of travel in a way. But I didn't really write about that in my book very much. But that's really a kind of a constant that people are, you might go somewhere because it's better not to be somewhere else. But that's not the same as the kind of culture of a kind of touristic culture of travel that you get even in pilgrimage in the later Middle Ages. So that's a
And
very long and involved
not
answer.
quite the same as migration either.
No.
Even though it's a different form of individual persecution that
Yeah.
is, yeah, it's solo. It's not you're not taking a group of people with you, and there's no pretension that you're doing it for any other reasons. I feel like with most of the mass migration movements that we think about in the early Middle Ages, there's a real connection of movement and the forging of one's identity, the rediscovering of a group identity.
Yeah.
Whereas,
Yeah.
yeah, these individual travelers, it's one of the things that strikes me about your book and about the individual accounts is often quite how little people are taking from travel, at least in terms of a personal uh, development or a personal, uh, alteration of the way they look at the world. Often there's just an extraordinary lack of curiosity about the other cultures they're running into and about what this might mean about their own culture.
Yeah. I mean, today you'd have there's a kind of whole subsection of geographical theory about attention and how we all make our own landscapes and our own worlds through the selective paying of attention to the world we move through. That, there will be people walking around central London. Well, everyone walking around central London will be experiencing it as a separate city today, through what they're paying attention to. Some will be looking at the historic stuff, some will be looking at the everyday stuff, some will be looking at the shop, some will be looking at the pavement, whatever. So attention, there's an argument that attention builds landscapes. And my travelers in the Middle Ages, their attention is often kind of misdirected, if you like, or directed inwards. There's the directing oneself inwards in the kind of St. Augustine or Boethius kind of way, that you're really using travel to think about, or exile to think about yourself and what's inside. But there's also the kind of direction inwards where you're using travel to think about to confirm your prior impressions and not to let yourself be troubled by what you see on your travels. And I think that is something which is very, very resonant with the way we use tourism today, that often people don't want the local food or the local language or the local customs. They want to travel in a way which is precisely replicating their own standards or their own comfort, or to go to a place which confirms for them what is easy to know about it rather than what's difficult to know about it.
And so, as an example, we could look at Margery Kemp's journey to Jerusalem. And her book is in some respects very descriptive, and she gets into a lot of details. But I find her trip to Jerusalem is the opposite of this. It's her most remarkable journey, and she has almost nothing to say about anything she sees. She has something to say about what she does and the places she went, and then this one Saracen she meets. But no notions on the cultural difference, the language difference, even the sort of architectural difference. And for us, it's striking, especially trying to figure out what it was like as a pilgrim in Jerusalem in her time. But I wonder what it was like for her, and whether her not mentioning the details. In your book, you mentioned frequently how unpleasant the pilgrimage to Jerusalem could be, and the conditions, and just not necessarily living up to, the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Sorry.
Oh, a visitor.
Sorry about that.
No, not to worry. It's all part of the journey we're
Margery
taking.
Kempe.
Yeah, Margery Kempe. There she was. She's always sneaking in. But yeah, and it's just curious to us that you go so far from home in a world we at least interpret not to be so aware of the wider world. And you get these travelers to Persia, to China, to sort of Southeast Asia, and these are places completely alien. Today we see pictures, we see films, we're familiar-ish with what an elephant looks like, enough that if we saw one in reality, we wouldn't be like, whoa, tusks. But how do we get around the fact that people like Margery Kempe, who do have a habit to talk a lot, go to somewhere astounding, even, if their attention is elsewhere, and just find absolutely no reason to mention 95% of the things they encounter.
I mean, I think like it's it's easy to judge late medieval pilgrims like Margery Kempe for their lack of, kind of observation. What we want is observational detail. But there was a very kind of well-developed stricture against them doing this. They were supposed to be there in imitation of Christ. They're supposed to be there to reflect on their own sinful, fallen souls and their own atonement for their own errors. And they were supposed to be looking inwards. And Kemp actually, I think, makes it quite clear that one of the things that she's holding in tension is the earthly Jerusalem and the heavenly Jerusalem, and she's trying to experience it as a biblical landscape. She's trying to experience it as a city of the soul, she calls it. And so it suits her kind of theology not to give us too much detail about it. The bits of detail she does give, you mentioned the Saracen she meets when she's at Mount Quarantine near Jericho, the hot Saracen, the good-looking Saracen who helps her up the mountain when her feet are burning. Yeah. I mean, that's a really, really unusual moment. Most writers who did these kinds of journeys don't talk like that about how there was an element of dependence on the local, but also an element of, how would you say, kind of exotic attraction to the local. But she also describes how she gives him a groat, she gives him some money. And so there's that kind of those interdependencies, which are a bit squalid and a bit uneven between the travelers and the people they're moving amongst, so made explicit there. She also does give us quite a lot of detail about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it's detail which entirely confirms a Western Catholic Franciscan way of looking at it. And so it's not detail which is historically that revealing, but it does actually confirm, in a way that has had significant historical consequences to the present day, that people could go to Jerusalem and see what they wanted to see, and emote how they wanted to emote, and to perform, to import a version of the city which they then manifested in reality, and kind of gives you a tabula rasa of the rest of the city. The other people aren't there, even the other Christian denominations who she's sharing the church with, and that, I think, is that's quite a significant and long-running way of people using holy space. She says even less about her trip to Santiago de Compostela. I mean, she literally just says she went there and then came back. Doesn't say anything else. And who knows why that is. But this is not entirely unusual. I think part of the point of pilgrimage is that you say you've been, that your soul has been reformed or soul has been transformed, and you come back, you put the badge on, and that's it. There's not, once you start talking about what the food was like, what the drink was like, what the weather was like, then you're straying into curiositas.
Yeah. Could you talk a bit about how this sort of Jerusalem tourism industrial complex sort of built up over the Middle Ages? How this sort of standard tour guide route that a Western Christian would take through the city, presumably with some specific other Westerners that would show you from place to place. Could you talk a bit about how this developed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a slightly complicated story, but it's surprisingly late that the Via Dolorosa tradition becomes fixed. Actually, after Margery Kempe's time, it's really a late 15th century.
Oh, really? Okay.
There are elements of the kind of Via Crucis, the way of the cross, obviously since the crucifixion, and Saint Helena, the kind of early archaeologist of the Bible, or kind of imaginative archaeologist, we might call her, who fixed where Calvary was and that kind of thing. But there are elements of it throughout this period. But then in the Crusader period, the Western European Crusaders um, assimilated a lot of Greek and Armenian and Georgian and Coptic and other Islamic sites that were existing and Jewish sites existing in Jerusalem, which led to some kind of many non-biblical sites. So things like there were 4 or 5 places called the Prison of Christ, which were places where Jesus was held during the crucifixion, which are not mentioned in the Bible at all. And these kind of multiplied, and there were local traditions, and there were kind of many post-biblical traditions. There were new medieval traditions. Then you also have this emphasis from the Crusader period and much more into the 14th century on the humanity of Christ and on the kind of human trials he underwent, particularly in his childhood and in the crucifixion, in the Passion. And so new sites start to develop. In the Crusader period, it's very much a negotiation between different communities and different places. After the failure of the Crusades, when Jerusalem has become a Mamluk city again, the city becomes much more regulated for Christian pilgrims. And the Mamluks kind of make a deal with the Franciscans. The Franciscans will operate as a kind of holy travel agency, and they will make sure that pilgrims only go to certain places and don't stray into other parts of the city. There's effectively freedom of worship for Christians and for Jews as long as they stay in certain itineraries and routes. And by the 1450s, you start to get this kind of Stations of the Cross, Via Dolorosa, coming up as a quite fixed itinerary from the Mount of Olives to Calvary, basically the shape it is now. And the stations start to, many of which have Crusader or Byzantine roots, but start to accrue their fixed form that they have now. Effectively, I would say the Jerusalem pilgrimage, as someone like Margery Kempe or Felix Fabry or William Way, or these people who I write about in the book a lot, they experienced it as a guided tour. They experienced it very much as we would think of the guided tour now, as a package tour even. They bought their package in Venice. The ship's controller was responsible for getting them to Jerusalem. Then they signed over some papers, said that they would hold this, effectively a passport with them, a bulletta, a little piece of paper, and they would carry it around with them, that they wouldn't go rogue, they wouldn't go off the beaten track, they wouldn't be curious. And they could go to Jaffa, Ramla, where there was a pilgrim hostel, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. And that was really it. And if you find medieval pilgrims anywhere else in the Holy Land, it's because they've either absconded from this route and taken a risk, kind of gone undercover, or because they are also doing some trade. They might be working with Venetian or Alexandrian merchants, for example. But the route becomes very, very fixed. And there's a safety element to it. There's also a kind of practical element to it that, you don't speak the language, the weather's terrible, it's not at all what you imagined. You're imagining a kind of green hill and beautiful biblical landscape, and instead
it's not like the paintings at all.
Yeah, you get scorching deserts and people throwing stones at you and people charging you every time you want to use the toilet or to get a glass of hot, terrible wine. And so it becomes fixed really for kind of safety, and the pilgrims can just see what they want to see. They can see the landscape of Jesus much more than seeing, the present day. So it's a journey to the past.
It's an unexpected similarity between now and then. You wouldn't think the kind of package holiday rip-off tour guide thing was equally true for Jerusalem pilgrims centuries ago, but it seems, I've had that holiday. There was perhaps less threat of Mamluk death, but nonetheless, the vibe was the same. And I wonder from the Mamluk point of view, was it solely to make a bit of cash off these pilgrims? Was it to regulate what would otherwise be a difficult, unregulated stream? What was their perspective on this entire, perhaps quite bizarre industry?
I think there was an element of money making, an element of straightforward regulation. I think it suited them. I mean, I think there were many people in the Mamluk government who didn't have a problem with Christian worship. You know, Jesus is a prophet in Islam, and they it was more the territorial ambitions of the Crusaders, or you know, so that there's quite different thing there. And I think it suited both the Franciscans and the Mamluks to have a kind of accommodation where the Franciscans had the Custodia Terra Sancta. They had effectively a kind of embassy as the sole representatives of the Western Church in the Holy Land. So they had done quite well for themselves. And it wasn't the Dominicans, it wasn't the Benedictines, it wasn't any of the Brigittines, any of these other orders. So they were representing Western Europe, and then that was hand in glove with the Venetian Empire, which, you know, the Venetian Empire went all the way to the Crimea and to Beirut and to Alexandria. They really had a kind of trading empire all over the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And so I think it suited everybody. They only really lasted for, you know, 150 years before it all went wrong. But it worked. It suited everyone's purposes to have a straightforward, stable, safe journey between Venice and Jaffa.
The last time Jerusalem was under Muslim control, pre-Crusader state, the Fatimid Sultanate, was it a similar deal, or if during this period the travelers were more elite, it didn't need to have such a sort of package orientation?
Yeah, and I mean, and then I think there's also a crucial difference in the theology of it, in that in 1096, when the First Crusade was proclaimed, it was described in very, very new ways as a kind of armed pilgrimage. By going on the crusade, you got this indulgence, plenary indulgence, all your sins wiped clean, and your time in purgatory reduced. That was a theological innovation in 1096, which earlier travelers hadn't had codified for them. So I think that kind of indulgence culture, which really is a late medieval thing, it starts in the First Crusade, then becomes a motivator for popular pilgrimage. Sorry, that, you know, rather than that kind of elite journey, which is a kind of research trip to the Bible, it actually becomes now a self-interested tour to get the indulgence and all the trappings that go with that. So it's a quite different kind of vibe.
I'm interested in the Venetian logistics before you reach Venice. If you're a Westerner, if you're from modern day Germany, France, Great Britain, Spain, are the Venetians helping you get to Venice in exchange for a sum of money or something in order to then shoot you off to the Franciscans in the Holy Land? Or is it just, first you've got to get to Venice somehow, and once you're in Venice, you get the package holiday?
The Venetians don't directly help you, but the Franciscans do. They set up pilgrim hostels throughout Europe, and other religious orders too. And also the Italian banking companies are very much involved in communications and in the intelligence you need to make sure your route's safe, but also to convert money on your route, which is a big obstacle for travelers.
Yeah. How many conversions are you getting in medieval Europe? It must be like
20
one every village.
Yeah. I mean, and the currency lists, which you often find in travel writing, you know, they describe these coins of, some of them are of each small town, and they have different. And so what you are advised to do is to go to one of the big companies. Say you're setting up from London or Bruges or Augsburg or somewhere. You go to one of the big Italian banking companies and you get a kind of letter of credit, and you can use that at several different places until you get to Venice, where you get ducats, and that's the kind of common currency for the Mediterranean at this point. The Venetian ducat is spread all the way throughout the Holy Land and what's now the kind of Croatia, Greece, all over there. Those kinds of they're very practical things. The Venetian Empire does, however, control the journey onwards from Venice. So all the places, the ports the boats stop at, apart from Dubrovnik, Ragusa, which was its own kind of rival republic, everywhere else, like Zadar, Pula, Corfu, Methone, Crete, Rhodes, is either part of Venice or acting very much as a client of the Venetian Republic. And so where the pilgrims then go and the travelers then go, it gives money back into the Venetian Republic. So it's a kind of airport alliance, or something like that, where the money never leaves the bigger company. It always going back into it. And you could see the Venetian lion at all these ports all the way, throughout Eastern Mediterranean. What happens before you get to Venice is that routes start to become very established, like the Brenner Pass. And I think for convenience, safety, and out of ignorance, that's what people end up having to use. So somewhere like Innsbruck or Bolzano or Constance, these become places that people just end up going to. And then that's how they thrive.
And I have a question that sort of leaps off that one, just as an asterisk almost. But I notice both in your translation of Margery Kempe and the travel book, there is a real sensitivity to currencies and to using the appropriate money in the appropriate place, which is always really a bit of a dog reading through history. Like, for instance, it's great in sort of a last few centuries of British history. It will say you have to have land amounting to £3 to vote, which to me sounds very reasonable. But then you find that £3 is an immense value and sum, and there is no easy conversion. It's not simply plug it in the calculator. Oh, that would be 20 million today. Great. It's an unknown translation. So I wonder, how do you deal with this, not only this variety of currencies, but how we understand how much something is worth? What is the value of a coin?
That's a really great question, and I think I'm going to have to sit very much on the fence about giving you a definitive answer. The National Archives does have a great website where it doesn't aim to convert historic currencies into a cash sum. It tells you what the purchasing power of it at a certain time was, and so given in horses, cows, wool, wheat, a tradesman's wages, and that kind of thing. And so it's obviously very, very rough. It's geographically and historically very contingent, but it does give you a rough sense of that. And so in the book of Margery Kempe, Bishop Philip Reppington of Lincoln gives Margery Kempe 26 shillings to go off on her journey. And if you put that into a currency converter, that comes out at £1,000 or £800 or something like that. It's still a lot of money. But actually, if you think about it as purchasing power, she actually buys her white clothes, and that's probably that's the money she seems to use to get her at least to Constance and Venice. By that point, she's had her money nicked off her. She's had her clothes cut short. She's been bullied. She's made every enemy she can. But so I think you could think of, say, 26 shillings and 8 pence as something like the cost of a new set of outfits and a ticket to Venice. So that probably would equate to £600-700 today, if you're thinking about it. The flip side to your question as well is, so people do, Margery Kempe talks about the Bolognino coin she gets given at one point. She talks about giving people groats when she as in payment. But there is a lot more emphasis and trust in material goods and charity, I think, because of this. This is still relatively early on in the kind of in the credit economy. There's lots of travelers do use letters of credit. Coins are obviously the basis for most people. Like hard coinage is the basis for most people of wealth. But then carrying a lot of coinage around with you on a long journey is very hazardous. You're going to drop it. You're going to be robbed. It's not going to be valid when you find out that your thalers of Ulm aren't worth anything when you get to Memmingen. So there's, you see a lot of emphasis on souvenirs, on jewelry, on portable stuff like finger rings, necklaces, bits of clothing, candles, where I think the value is more fixed, but also it's safer to carry it or easier to carry it. All pilgrims, more or less, Margery Kempe is distinctive amongst them because she does this very explicitly, but most pilgrims found themselves to be either rich throughout their journey because they planned it that way and they were super rich, or they became poor in their journey because everything was more expensive, more hazardous. They were not able to withstand being ripped off because there were certain things they needed, like clean wine or beer, or they needed passage from one place to another. And they all complain. I write about this in my book. They complain about being held at Venice for much longer than they want to be because the ship's captains won't go, and then they're left there basically shopping when they don't want to be shopping. So most pilgrims find themselves worrying about money, and so actual objects, material objects, I think, are much more secure for them.
Another thing that changes town for town in certain instances is language. It's one of the fascinating things about traveling at this time, and this is a really a sort of language that's more unregulated than we can imagine now. If you're on like the Swedish-Norwegian border, you'll be able to speak to the Norwegians on the other side, and they'll be able to speak to you. But you won't be able to speak to Swedes on the other side of the country, and the Norwegian guy on the other side of the border won't be able to speak to Norwegians on the other side of his country. It's much more of a spectrum than a sort of centralized, sort of standardized mode of communication, a language. I was recently at a sort of Middle Ages concert in the Palatine, where it was a man was introducing various sort of medieval songs from the region, from the Rhineland, and then singing them. And more or less without exception, I found the Middle High German more easy to understand than his local modern day Palatine Low German speech. I suppose because it has more influence on the modern day High German that I know, and has more overlaps with English as well. There are all sorts of fascinating moments in Margery Kempe where she communicates with someone somehow, and then we later learn that she's not been able to speak to anyone in a few months. That especially on her second trip to Germany, she like asks someone directions, and then she asks another group of people directions, and then she meets an English person, and she writes, "Oh, what a relief it was to finally be understood by someone." I like wonder how are people communicating with each other if they are in the situation like Margery, just plopped in the middle of.
I mean, the truth is that often they're not communicating with each other, or they're miscommunicating, and so I think we should keep that as in there. That it's happened to all of us. We've ended up somewhere and got on the wrong train in the wrong direction, or we've misunderstood that something's open when it's closed, or vice versa. There is an element of how you described it. Margery Kempe's from King's Lynn in the east of England, and her father, her husband, her son and were all involved in Baltic trade across the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. And there would have been more proximity, I think, between the languages heard in King's Lynn with those heard in what's now Holland and Northern Germany than there would have been, say, with Cornish or people in the Northwest or something. You know, her English would have been closer to this family of languages that people in the Middle Ages called Deutsch, which is the same word as Deutsch, but is also the same word as Dutch, and it's this kind of language across Northern Europe. She also, the Latin Mass and the Latin liturgy gives people a lingua franca through religion, so they can understand certain things. When she's in Italy and she meets her patroness, Margaret Florentine, they have this conversation in a kind of English, French, Italian, which is an amazing window into how people got by. And she says, Margeria in poverty. And Margery says, "Ja, madame, grande pauvreté." So they're speaking kind of, they can get by. And it shows that they understand certain things about kind of Romance languages as a family and choosing words which are Latinate, which they can share. There's a lot in some other writing about having a guide or a dragoman who will be able to translate for you, and the languages you should make sure he speaks. But I think people often, they had to get by on signs and tokens and gestures and that kind of thing, and they were very susceptible to being told the wrong thing. There is a bit in the book of Margery Kempe where she hears people calling her an English tale, saying that
Stuart.
An English stat. And I've put in the notes to my book that this might have been a misunderstanding because maybe they were calling her a Stetzer, which was a German word for a kind of vagabond or tramp, as she was at this point walking age 60 from Prussia to England. Or stört, which was a German word for kind of annoying or disruptive or something like that,
and remains one today.
Yeah. So she might have misunderstood this and heard the Middle English word stört and thought they were saying she had a tail, which was a jibe the French made about the English. And then she takes umbrage, and there's a whole kind of misunderstanding. And you can just imagine that playing out today. It probably put on TikTok or Reddit or something of someone arguing about, you said I had a tail. No, I didn't. I just said that you were annoying. And that kind of sense of misunderstanding. And again, it's very human. It's very kind of understandable that people can have those kinds of cultural misunderstandings.
There's also a language miracle in Margery Kempe. Her German.
There's a couple, yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking in particular of her German confessor in Rome, who is able to miraculously understand her speaking English, and vice versa. And she makes sure it's provable, as she does with all of her miracles, by saying some other people came and they were astonished. But just from personal experience, you do get that kind of thing quite a lot with me and Anna, for girlfriend, for example. We have like at times like a very weird Angloich, Deutsch, Denglish thing going on that isn't quite either language. Yeah,
and you might like Wenzel, her confessor in Rome, he might have eventually just understood what was going on from kind of, the more general factors rather than word for word. And I think like all these accounts, they're partial, and they are self-serving to some extent, but I think there is that sense of she was in Rome for the best part of a year, and she doesn't, her book doesn't describe her becoming acculturated to that, but she must have been at some level. And if she's confessing to this German guy, then they've got a relationship in some language and in some form of communication. So I think attributing it to God's graceful intervention is one way of understanding it, but you can also see that actually when you've been somewhere for a year, you probably would be able to get by a bit better than when you arrived.
Were there Were there any travel sort of analogues who were interested in some of the peoples, some of the Semitic peoples in like the Holy Land when they arrived? And maybe in terms of language, I'm thinking, yeah, the these kinds of lingua franca attempts to communicate with each other, or is it so locked down by the Mamluks that kind of interaction is basically impossible?
I think the interaction is difficult, but and often misunderstood. So, we know from Jewish sources that lots of the guides were Palestinian Jews, Jews living in Jerusalem, who appeared to the European visitors, to be Mamluk Arabs because they didn't understand who they were encountering. Okay. There is a fascinating pilgrim, a very unusual one, called Arnold von Harff, who travels from Germany in 1499. And he goes undercover as a spy, and he does try to meet some of the people there. But he gives a glossary of Jerusalemite Hebrew, which is taken from the Bible. It's all just biblical Hebrew, and it's not at all conversational, or what anyone would have spoken to him, and some bits of Arabic, which are equally kind of implausible. But there is a curiosity about the people are curious about Islamic customs. They're curious about veiled women. You see this more and more in the 15th century. They're curious about alcohol, and that's a practical thing because the wine got worse when you went into Islamic areas, but there was wine available. It was only known clean water that people were getting there was distilled drinks. And so there was a kind of why, there were obviously Greek Christians and there were Jews selling wine as well who weren't Muslims, but there was a lot of misunderstanding about where the wine came from, why it was so bad, and why the Muslims didn't drink it, and this kind of thing. I think that sense of wandering into a landscape a culture you didn't understand is throughout all the 15th century things. But yeah, there are elements of curiosity in some of the later ones about Islam and about Arab culture, but it wasn't able to be very fully developed.
And when we get further into the book, we go further afield, and we arrive in Ethiopia, which has a foreign alphabet and quite a different language, and then we go into India and into the elements of the Far East, and these travelers are far fewer, and to my understanding, seem largely to be of a more mercantile class.
Yeah, so they're either missionaries or merchants.
So they aren't quite there on the same lower level touristic mission, and also have different things they're interested in. Perhaps they're not so interested in the observation and the language. But do we have any of these people, the real sort of wily and brave types, who went to the fringes of the medieval world, or indeed expanded them, who really looked into, what are the Chinese and Mongol languages actually like? Or is it so completely ungraspable? Because I imagine there'd be very few, especially in the early years, of people who could have any language in common until we get to sort of the middle zones, things like Farsi or whatever.
Yeah.
How did that work out?
The Italian missionaries in China, one of the first things they send for back from Europe are books and grammars to teach people Latin. And they're just desperate, really, not to learn their language, but to teach people their language. I think, it's a good question. So, in terms of India, where obviously there's hundreds of local languages and not one standard language even today, the people I write about there in the 15th century who are merchants who go there, they have a terrible journey. It all goes very, very badly wrong for them. But they do seem to be able to get by at buying and selling and moving around the country quite easily. They travel enormous distances to the Maldives, to what's now Burma, Bangladesh, and up to the other side of India. And so they're really quite mobile. And there's we know that there's things like brothels and caravanserais set up for merchants. What language they're speaking in there, I tend to think it's more kind of just gestures and money rather than exactly rather than full sentences. Yeah.
But well, I'll go back to Ethiopia briefly because I think Ethiopia is an interesting case. Just the notion of Prester John, who
Yeah.
is this character who is believed to exist beyond the fringes of medieval Europe, will at some point redeem the failure of the Crusades and march in with a mass of civilization linked to this notion of Antipodean civilization. There is another Europe or Europe style thing that exists and is going to march over and save us. But then we have people who actually get there and they see the place, and somehow instead of coming to the conclusion that Prester John doesn't exist, their conclusion is he definitely does exist. I met him, or his emissary. How do we make sense of that?
Well, Prester John moves around a lot from India to Ethiopia, so that's also kind of, well, he wasn't there, so we'll put him here, or maybe he could still be there if he's been here. And I think, one of the things that's powering my book, one of the questions that's powering the book, is how medieval people were trying to make sense of a world they didn't fully know. So they knew the world was round, but they didn't know how to get around it. They knew there was more land out there that they hadn't yet experienced, but they didn't know how to get there or how to name it. And so it's more like how we think perhaps of the sea or space as something that is kind of existing, but not fully charted or chartable, and full of plausible mysteries and implausible mysteries. And we are not qualified to judge which are which. Prester John gives people hope that the world is designed by a benevolent, loving Christian God, and everything out there will fall into that kind of apocalyptic shape of a whole world. But I think it's a very flexible myth, and quite a kind of I don't know, a varied myth, let's say. It never achieves one stable form.
Well, thank you very much for the chat, Anthony. Wonderful talking to you.
No, I'd love to carry on talking. There's so much. I mean, there is literally a whole world out there in the Middle Ages. Yet, my book only really scratches the surface of it, and there's a lot more to be done on this travel writing. And I'd encourage people to think about the sources they can uncover and the material that's still waiting to be played with.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and you're very welcome back on if the inclination ever takes you.
No, it's really nice to talk to you both. And thanks for having me.